Welcome back, and if you're new here, I need you to stay until the very end of this video. Because what I'm going to show you in the next 8 minutes is something that every mainstream news channel is covering, but none of them are actually explaining. Less than 1 hour ago, the Israeli Defense Forces confirmed another wave of Iranian ballistic missiles launched towards central and southern Israel. Air raid sirens, shelters, interceptor streaks lighting up the sky. Again. But here is what they are not telling you. This is not just a missile attack. This is an economic weapon, disguised as a military operation, and it is working. Because right now, today, the total economic damage from this conflict has crossed a threshold that economists are calling genuinely alarming. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, has described what is happening as, and these are their exact words, the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Not the greatest challenge of this decade, not the greatest challenge since Ukraine, the greatest in history, and it all connects back to those 50 missiles that were launched less than an hour ago. Let me show you exactly how, from the beginning, with real numbers. To understand the $1 trillion question, you need to understand what triggered this war in the first place. Because the financial damage didn't start with the missiles. It started the moment the first American bomb fell on Iranian soil. On February 28, 2026, just 28 days ago, the United States and Israel launched a surprise joint military operation against Iran, codenamed Operation Roaring Lion by Israel and Operation Epic Fury by the U.S. The Israeli Air Force alone deployed approximately 200 fighter jets, the largest combat sortie in its entire history, striking 500 military targets across western and central Iran in a single day. Over 1,200 bombs dropped in 24 hours. And at the very top of the target list, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the opening strike. The stated goals were regime change, elimination of Iran's nuclear program, and restoration of regional stability. Within hours, Iran fired back, and it has not stopped firing since. Between February 28th and March 4th alone, just the first 5 days, ACLED researchers recorded more than 90 attempted Iranian strikes against Israel. 20 of those directly hit civilian areas, 10 people were killed, and that 5-day total represented more than 60% of every Iranian strike recorded during the entire 12-day war last June. 60% of an entire war's worth of attacks in 5 days. The financial markets saw it in real time, and they reacted accordingly. Now let's talk about the number that changes everything, the number that is sitting inside every classified briefing in Washington and Jerusalem right now, but that nobody is saying plainly on television. On the first day of this war, February 28th, Iran was firing approximately 90 missiles per day at Israel. By day 10, that number had dropped to around 10 missiles per day, a more than 90% reduction, which the IDF credits to successful targeting of Iranian launchers and storage facilities. The U.S. military's CENTCOM chief confirmed just 2 days ago that 2/3 of Iran's arms manufacturing facilities have now been destroyed. That sounds like a victory, and in one sense it is, but here's the critical detail that gets lost in that framing. Even 10 missiles per day cost Israel an enormous amount to intercept, because Israel's layered defense system Arrow for high altitude, David's Sling for medium range, Iron Dome for short range does not fire once per incoming missile. It fires multiple interceptors per threat to guarantee a kill. Arrow interceptors cost $2 to $3 million each. David's Sling runs approximately $1 million per unit, and David's Sling has already had a documented failure confirmed by the Israeli Air Force itself when 2 Iranian ballistic missiles broke through on March 22nd and struck the southern cities of Dimona and Arad, injuring nearly 200 people. The IAF said the 2 failures were unconnected, entirely coincidental, 2 separate errors, same night, same region, same consequences, nearly 200 injured, hundreds of kilograms of conventional explosives detonating inside residential areas, extensive damage to buildings and infrastructure. And Israel's finance ministry has now done the full accounting. The air conflict with Iran is damaging the Israeli economy by more than 9 billion shekels, approximately $2.93 billion every single week, under current red alert restrictions, which close schools, ban gatherings, limit workplace activity, and keep reserve forces mobilized. The weekly loss sits at 9.4 billion shekels. Even if restrictions are eased to orange level, the weekly damage remains at 4.3 billion shekels, nearly $3 billion per week. In a country whose annual GDP is approximately $520 billion, that is before you even count the missile interception costs. That is just the economic shutdown from the alert conditions. Less than an hour ago, those missiles were launched again, and most coverage will show you the interception footage and call it a defensive success. What that coverage won't show you is what happened when David's Sling failed on March 22nd, and what it won't explain is the cluster munition problem that has been running underneath the headline numbers since the very first week. Iran's use of cluster warheads in this conflict was described by the executive director of the Arms Control Association as deliberate. In his words, Iran appears to be launching them into relatively populated areas, probably with the goal of producing potential civilian harm. A cluster warhead doesn't work the same way a conventional warhead does. If you successfully intercept the main missile body after the cluster shell has already opened during descent, the submunitions are already falling, dozens of them, unguided, into neighborhoods, into streets, into gardens that children play in. One cluster missile with a 100-kilogram warhead confirmed in the Tel Aviv strikes punched gaping holes through a multi-story apartment building. 6 people were lightly injured at 4 separate impact sites in a single night. Police in Tel Aviv were simultaneously dealing with multiple impact sites from a single barrage. The Arms Control Association's documentation of this isn't a fringe concern. It is a legal and strategic reality that changes how you assess every successful interception statistic you see on your screen. Because even a 95% interception rate against cluster munitions is not the same as a 95% interception rate against conventional warheads. Now we get to the number in the title, the number that is genuinely alarming economists worldwide. Because the damage from this conflict is not primarily coming from missile impact sites in Israel. That damage, confirmed by the Israel Tax Authority after 11 days of fighting, stands at several hundred million shekels in direct property claims. Significant, but manageable in isolation. The $1 trillion figure comes from somewhere else entirely. It comes from the Strait of Hormuz. Through that 24-mile-wide waterway flows approximately 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products every single day, roughly 1/5 of everything the entire planet consumes. Additionally, 30% of all globally traded liquefied natural gas transits through the same passage. Iran has mined the strait. The IRGC has deployed fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, and drone swarms. The London Insurance Markets Joint War Committee has removed war risk coverage from vessels transiting the strait. And without insurance, ships cannot legally operate. Banks will not finance the voyages. Ports will not accept the cargo. A research study published by Delft University of Technology analyzing 10,000 tankers across 1,315 global ports concluded that $1.2 trillion in annual exports from 5 Gulf nations alone are directly at risk, and that number rises to $1.5 trillion when cascading supply chain disruption is included. Brent crude, which was trading near $70 a barrel before February 28th, peaked at $126 during this conflict. That is an 80% increase in 28 days. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate reductions. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks the European gas price standard, nearly doubled to over $60 per megawatt hour. Qatar suspended LNG production after strikes on the Ras Laffan industrial city. The IEA issued its warning. European gas storage entering this crisis was at just 30% capacity following a harsh winter. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published modeling concluding that the Hormuz closure is expected to lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter of 2026. Solability's broader analysis puts the total at-risk figure at $3.5 trillion of global GDP in a prolonged closure scenario. And here is the detail that receives almost no attention in the mainstream coverage. Gulf states themselves Kuwait, Iraq. The UAE began curtailing oil production in early March because their local storage was filling up with oil that had nowhere to go. Oil priced at $126 per barrel that they cannot sell. Because the export route is closed, rising prices, blocked exports, stranded inventory. The economic model that has governed the Persian Gulf for 50 years inverted in a single week. Because this conflict is not contained to Israel and Iran, let me show you how wide it has actually become. Iran has confirmed strikes against at least 27 U.S. military bases spread across Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. A drone struck Britain's Akrotiri military base in Cyprus. Missiles were shot down over Turkey. Strikes hit civilian infrastructure in Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, and Oman. 2 ballistic missiles were reportedly launched toward Diego Garcia, the remote British-American military base in the Indian Ocean. The Houthis in Yemen have re-entered the conflict, firing drones at Israel and threatening Red Sea shipping lanes, the same lanes that were already partially disrupted during the Gaza conflict. The Times of Israel has confirmed that approximately $1 trillion worth of goods passed through the Red Sea annually before the Houthi campaign began. That route is now under renewed threat simultaneously with Hormuz. Lebanon is a second front. Since March 2nd, Hezbollah has carried out more than 3,500 attacks against Israel rockets, missiles, and UAVs. Israel has responded with over 250 strikes across Lebanon. At least 1,116 people have been killed in Lebanon since Israel renewed widespread operations there. Among them are at least 121 children. More than 1 million Lebanese civilians have been displaced. Iraq is a third front. At least 96 people have been killed in Iraq, most of them members of Iran-backed paramilitary groups. U.S. forces have struck IRGC-aligned militia headquarters in Anbar province. 7 rockets were launched from the Iraqi town of Rabia toward a U.S. military base in northeastern Syria just days ago. Over 4,000 daily flight cancellations from Gulf airspace closures, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways suspended, Air India, British Airways, Lufthansa, Virgin Atlantic redirected. Hundreds of thousands of passengers stranded. Airline losses estimated in the billions. By March 7th, the Iranian Red Crescent reported that over 6,668 civilian units had been targeted by U.S.-Israeli strikes inside Iran, including 5,535 residential buildings, 141 commercial units, 14 medical centers, and 65 schools. As of March 23rd, Harana, the human rights activist news agency, estimated that at least 15% of total casualties inside Iran had been under the age of 18. Here is the analysis that I don't hear in mainstream coverage, and this is the part that matters most for understanding where this conflict goes from here. Iran is not trying to win this war militarily. Iran's planners know with absolute clarity that they cannot defeat the combined military capacity of the United States and Israel in a conventional engagement. They are not attempting to. What Iran is doing is something far more strategically sophisticated. They are running a cost exchange operation against a finite defensive system. Before this war began, Iran possessed approximately 2,500 long-range ballistic missiles. Hundreds have now been launched, destroyed in storage, or targeted on launchers. The rate of Iranian missile fire has dropped from 90 per day to approximately 10 per day, a reduction driven partly by suppression and partly, analysts believe, by deliberate conservation of remaining inventory for a longer war. Iran's military planners calculated correctly that the global economic pressure generated by threatening Hormuz would accomplish what direct missile strikes on Israeli cities cannot. It would force a reckoning that goes beyond military outcomes. It would make the financial cost of continuing this conflict impossible to ignore. $2.93 billion per week in Israeli economic losses, 126 oil, Qatar's LNG offline, the Red Sea under threat, 3.5 trillion of global GDP at risk. And the U.S. is now asking Congress for an additional $200 billion in supplemental war funding. The Pentagon wants $200 billion more for a war that began 28 days ago with stated goals of rapid regime change and nuclear elimination. The regime has not changed. A new supreme leader has been appointed, Khamenei's son. The missiles are still flying. Hezbollah is still firing. The Houthis are re-engaged. And the bill is $200 billion and growing. ACLED's analysis is precise on this point. Full capitulation encompassing the abandonment of Iran's nuclear and missile programs and its anti-U.S., anti-Israel posture remains unlikely, even after the killing of Khamenei. Hardline elements within the IRGC are likely dominating decision-making. Iran is not collapsing. It is adapting, and the adaptation is happening through economics, not battlefield victories. Less than 1 hour ago, those missiles launched again. And the mainstream coverage will show you the interception footage, the streaks of light, the government press conference, the officials who will use words like successful engagement and operational readiness. What they will not show you is the full weight of what those numbers mean together. 28 days of war, $2.93 billion per week in Israeli economic losses, oil at 126 up 80% from before the conflict began, Qatar's LNG offline, the Strait of Hormuz functionally closed, $1.5 trillion in Gulf trade at direct risk, $3.5 trillion in global GDP threatened, over 4,000 daily flight cancellations, airlines losing billions, schools closed across Israel, 1,116 dead in Lebanon, 96 dead in Iraq, David's sling failing over Dimona, cluster bomblets in children's playgrounds, a $200 billion supplemental war funding request sitting in Congress, and Iran still firing, every day. The question is not whether Israel's air defenses can intercept the next wave of missiles. They probably can at enormous cost. The question is the one that no government is answering honestly. At what point does the financial and economic reality of sustaining this conflict force decisions that are more consequential than any single missile strike? At $3 billion per week in Israeli economic losses, when does the math change the politics? At 126, oil and $3.5 trillion in global GDP at risk, when does the pressure on Washington to find an off-ramp become impossible to resist? Those missiles launched an hour ago, and the clock is running.